Perhaps it's the Savior coming back. When I was a young man in Illinois, we had this occurrence when thousands of shooting stars fell throughout the night one time, and the people were running into the streets expecting that the end of the world had come. And I had done a little bit of study and tried to assure them that there was a scientific explanation, but I think they prefer the more spiritual one. Anyway, I am, it sounds like things are going better now, very pleased to have this opportunity to be with you this evening. I must say that upon my departure, I discovered that Mr. Stanton apparently did not approve of this particular trip. My secretary said, "Mr. President, Stanton is not happy. He thinks you're a blamed fool for going out there right now, especially with the election coming up in the fall. It's just going to look like your first stump speech." And I said, "Well, Johnny, I can't. There's nothing I can do about Stanton. I reckon if he thinks I'm a fool, I must be one. He knows more about those things than I do." But I expect it so that, if I were as I have been most of my life, I could stand up here for half an hour or so and tell stories and carry on and nobody'd be hurt by it. But in my present position, I have to be so careful. It seems like every word I utter is so closely noted that it just won't do for me to make foolish statements. Now I can see it. In fact, a good example, I won't say just where this happened, but coming out here, I happened to be requested to speak at a large city on one particular occasion, and on my arrival, I discovered that they'd scheduled me to speak the following morning, also over at the station, which was not that far. Well, I only had one address prepared, and I knew I was going to have to repeat myself. And then I met the gentleman from the press at the door, and these days they write down everything a feller says, not to mention a few things he never said. So I said, "Now, gentlemen, I don't have any objection at all if you want to write down the entire text of my remarks this evening, but I do have one request. They just informed me I'm supposed to speak over at the station in the morning, and I only have one address prepared, so would you mind just doing me the favor of postponing publishing my remarks till the afternoon edition? That way I can have first go at them again in the morning." Well, they seemed like they're pretty agreeable to that, but I did pick up a paper the next morning and took a look and said the president had been in the city, made remarks, none of which could be printed. So I best be careful here. I'll get carried away, start telling jokes, and I'm in trouble. Even political jokes, sometimes they get elected, and then we're all in trouble. So, actually, there's been some doubt as to whether I can be reelected. Things look pretty good at the Republican convention last June, but the casualties of the summer are mounting, and we'll see what happens. But then nobody expected me to be elected the first time. I think I could say this without any mock modesty. I'm probably about the humblest individual, the most unlikely to have ever been elevated to the office of the presidency. I have been called unqualified, uncouth, unprepared, uneducated, unkempt, unattractive, most of which is true. I actually prefer to think of myself as self-educated, self-made. I've always been a Whig in politics, and we always were in favor of the self-made man, but then not everybody's a Whig. In fact, I happened to mention that one time, and was at the state Republican convention in Illinois. A fella come up to me afterward. He said, "Did I hear you saying that you was a self-made man?" I said, "Yes, sir. What there is of me's pretty well self-made." He said, "Well, I think you did a blame poor job of it, sonny." Oh, and then he says, "I wouldn't vote for you if you were St. Peter himself." I looked at him, I said, "Well, friend, if I were St. Peter, you probably wouldn't be in my district anyway." Well, being back in this district again puts me in mind of my first trip out here several years ago, shortly before I was elected to my present esteemed position. In fact, Kansas was still a territory. The summer and fall previously, I had been engaged in a series of debates with the late Senator Douglas from Illinois, and our fame was spreading. Mark Delahaye, Colonel Delahaye from Kansas, and his family come out to help us. Actually, his wife is a cousin of mine. She's a former Hanks, but nonetheless. Then he returned the favor by asking me to come out and help with the Kansas Republican Convention in Osawatomie. I couldn't come, but the following November he again asked me if I could come out to support the Republican cause just before your general election, and I was able to. And so I'll never forget it because I near froze. It was the coldest December. Generally, Illinois doesn't get that cold in December, but we had, well, I remember upon my arrival in Leavenworth, I heard of the first news I got after I disembarked. I crawled out from under about 16 buffalo robes. John Brown had been hanged. It struck me with such force. Half the country was rejoicing. Now here was a man, think about this, who was so convinced that he was on the side of the right and that the Almighty had endorsed his actions, and yet he was convicted and hung, a criminal. It's singular to me how divided we had become at that juncture. Nearly half the country was convinced, like Brown, that slavery was wrong and ought to be stopped in its farther spread, and the other half seemed to be now convinced that slavery was right and ought to be allowed to spread in the name of liberty. Both sides read the same Bible, prayed to the same God, and each had begun to invoke his aid against the other. But such beliefs on either side cannot excuse violence. Bloodshed, an attempt to overthrow our system, our Constitution. We have nothing if we have no rule of law. Of course, those who were rejoicing at his death, only a brief year and a half later, were themselves attempting to overthrow the Constitution. What times we have come through. I think of the initial passage of Kansas, Nebraska, and all the upheaval. It was supposed to settle all of the issues, put an end to the slavery agitation. Popular sovereignty, they called it. It proved false in all of its glorious promises. It was supposed to give you greater control of your affairs here in Kansas. It didn't. It was supposed to give the people in the territory additional privileges. It revoked them. I remember thinking how interesting it was that after some 5 years of continuing struggle, fires, destructions, murders, bloodshed, several state constitutions, what was it, 3? Parade of some 26 governors and temporary governors, all appointed by pro-slavery presidents trying to force slavery down your throats here. That somehow the people of Kansas had managed to secure a free state constitution. That thing was conceived in violence. It was passed in violence. It was sustained in violence. And that violence, as terrible as it was in an attempt to establish slavery here, proved to be a mild precursor to what we have passed through in the past 4 years. However, in the midst of unprecedented political troubles, we yet have cause for thanksgiving. The Almighty has given us as a people a resolve and a determination to sustain this government in the midst of the greatest trial that free people can pass through. A war unlike anything ever witnessed in this republic. I don't think that words are sufficient. But I wish to tender my thanks to the people of Kansas for their contribution in this mighty struggle. Not only did you struggle for some 6 years against vicious border warfare, but then after the rebellion commenced, you sent a larger percentage of your own citizens than any other state to continue fighting. And you lost more, at least in proportion to your population, than any other state, at least to date. May I simply say that if the people of Kansas were not the kind of people they were, and I trust continue to be today, they had not been willing to risk everything to pass through Iowa and come to this place, sometimes sacrificing everything in the name of freedom, Kansas would have passed into the Union as a slave state. And I doubt that a brand spanking new Republican Party could have ever obtained national prominence, much less won a national election, if the people of Kansas had not resisted those efforts. It's probable that if they had not, and the Republicans had not won, that the rebellion would not have taken place. But it is certain thereon that the legal ground for emancipation would not have taken place either. God bless the people of Kansas. We were in a vast minority then. We came from the four winds. As I said, I was a former Whig. We had former Democrats, know-nothings. But we assembled on the premise that slavery was a wrong, that it was a moral, social, political evil. We had proper consideration for its presence among us. And all the constitutional constraints that had been thrown around it, and the terrible difficulty of ever getting rid of it, therefore, in any satisfactory way. But we looked for a policy from this government that would treat it as a wrong. And our primary object was to prevent its farther spread into the territories where our votes could properly reach it. But of course, it was not fashionable any longer to call it wrong. You couldn't call it wrong anywhere in the North, state or territory. You don't have it there. You just stir up more fuss down in the South. But of course you couldn't call it wrong in the South, where they did have it, because it was protected by law. You couldn't call it wrong anywhere in politics. Oh, that'd be bringing morality into politics. Goodness knows we don't want any of that. But you couldn't call it wrong from the pulpit. That'd be dragging politics into religion. We couldn't have that neither. And for those of you who remember, we had come to a place in this society where a moral, social, political evil could not find a place where anyone could speak of it as such. To do so was forcing your abolitionist doctrines down their throats. And we were not. It was a sacred right of self-government. I understand about self-government. That lies at the foundation of all my ideas of a just government, from beginning to end. Every man ought to make himself. That's good old-fashioned Whig doctrine. But the right, so-called, that one man takes of making a slave out of another and then calling it self-government has no possible application unless you suppose that other is not a man. And that is precisely why I think Senator Douglas and a good many others had a difficult time perceiving that there could be any moral difficulty in legislating against the Negro, because they failed to perceive consistently the black man's humanity. He wholly subscribed to the Dred Scott decision. He treated it as some sort of, thus saith the Lord. A black man has no legal right to sue for his own freedom because he is not a legal person, but a thing. The problem was, as a nation, we began by declaring that all men are created equal. A sentiment, excuse my being slightly partisan, but a sentiment described by the very founder of the Democratic Party. But after we'd grown fat and sleek and forgotten what it was like to live under the tyranny of King George, the successor to the leadership of that same party came along and qualified the statement to read, all men are created equal, well enough, except black ones. Well, my friends, 4 years ago, if the know-nothings had gotten control, it would now be reading, all men are created equal, except black ones, and Irish ones, and German ones, and who knows where it would have stopped. Frankly, if it had come to that, I think I would have just soon emigrated to some other country. Maybe Russia. I mean, you can take your tyranny there under the czars, pretty pure, unadulterated by the base alloy of hypocrisy. But thankfully, I mean, only 20 years before all of this, the South had voted almost unanimously, except for South Carolina, but then they're never with anyone, against the African slave trade. We were all agreed on Jefferson's principle then, but something changed. Oh, we all still declared for liberty, but in that 20-year period, in using the same word, we no longer meant the same thing. With some, the word liberty still meant that each man can do precisely as he pleases with himself and the fruit of his labor. But now, with others, it meant that some men can do precisely as they please with other men and the fruit of their labor. Now, here are two not only different, but absolutely incompatible things, both being called by the same name, liberty. Who knows where it would have stopped? I'll tell you where it did stop. Right here. The halting to this progress events began right here by men and women whose honor required it of them, who were willing to put all, even life itself, down for the sake of honor. And in some cases, they indeed did surrender their lives. Because of the efforts of people like you, a Republican administration was elected. The intimidations and the threats of violence didn't stop. In fact, they spread on a national scale. When this administration was inaugurated, it was under extreme duress. Immediately after the fall of Fort Sumter, the nation's capital was put into a condition of siege. All of the roads were closed, the telegraph lines were cut, mails were stopped. And we discovered that in nearly every department of the government, there were aiders and abettors of this rebellious cause who were now, in the name of liberty, freedom of speech, habeas corpus, getting up a very capable corps of spies, informers, suppliers. You know, my friends, I believe that we of this generation, certainly this administration, are going to be remembered in spite of ourselves. I don't think any personal significance or insignificance is going to spare any one or other of us. We live in momentous times. They have said, at least of the world's history hitherto, that might makes right. I frankly believe it is for us and for our time to reverse that maxim. Say that right makes might. You see, the struggle embraces really more than just the fate of these United States. It embraces man's vast future. It actually presents to us a very difficult question. And the question is there in free government a fatal flaw? Something that the framers had not yet, or maybe feared to consider. Must a free government, in order to be free, be so weak that in times such as this, it cannot sustain itself? Or must it, in order to do so, to fight against internal enemies, become so strong that it actually destroys the very liberty it was conceived to protect? Those early days, I think it was actually the people of Kansas who provided an answer to that frightening question. And that answer was pure and simple: self-government. No 13th Amendment was being considered. But they evidenced an internal fortitude and a personal resolve sufficient to press through all of the difficulties and to govern themselves the way they desired. They suffered. They resisted. They endured great personal loss. They were offered bribes, rather tempting bribes. The English bill was nothing more than that. But they voted it down. They were swindled by devious government officials. They just reformed their ranks and kept coming. When they were accused of being treasonous, they reformed their political organizations and kept after it. Essentially, you've outlasted them all. And so I hope that those with whom I am here surrounded this night continue to have sufficient resolve to nerve themselves for the remainder of the task that lies ahead, and to leave nothing undone to bring about the triumph of right. I just beg of you, as citizens of this great republic, not to let your minds be carried off from the great issues of our day by secondary matters, There is more involved in this contest than is realized by everyone. Well, I suppose some of you may be concerned about the progress of our arms, upon which all else depends. The reports are not good. Frankly, over the past month, public announcements have been called forth on nearly every point and phase of the struggles. I have high hope for the future, but I don't wish to make any predictions respecting it. But there is one thing that I suppose I could say with complete impunity, because I have been asked to say it. Somebody asked me earlier if I would mind if I could find a place to repeat the remarks made at the dedication of the National Cemetery at Gettysburg last November. And I certainly agreed to do that. I don't know if any of you had opportunity to read Dr. Everett's remarks. I mean, all in this struggle have contributed of their resources. It's the soldier, however, who often renders up his life for his country's cause. And our thanks ought to be for the soldier. But you know, Dr. Everett brought attention to the efforts of the women in this country. And if you have not read his remarks, I wish you to do so. I say that because being here, I am reminded of how in a mere 5 years, Senator Douglas had completely debauched public opinion in regard to the black man and written him out of the Constitution. When 5 years before, no man in this country would have dared to stand up publicly and made exceptions to that great principle of freedom. You know, the ones who are shaping and molding public opinion in this country, they are the ones who hold the power. They make the enforcing of our laws and principles either possible or impossible. And what Dr. Everett said at Gettysburg was, it's been largely the efforts of women over the past year that has sustained public opinion sufficient to carry the proclamation of emancipation. Through sanitary fairs and all kind of public events, crafting small articles and making them for sale, they have turned the tide almost single-handedly. Well, I don't wish to repeat his remarks, but I will repeat mine. I had used these words. 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth upon this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We've come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate. We cannot consecrate. We cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here, have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will no long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead, we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion. That we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people shall not perish from the earth. Prayer. I am glad that we can meet together today under different circumstances than then. We have passed beyond the high water mark, I believe. After 3 years' struggle, the question finally presents itself to us: how shall we conclude this contest? Will the coming election turn us from our original resolve? Must partisan questions of the present moment cause us to forget our fundamental purpose in this? Are we going to return to the old, the tried, the true? Or shall we continue on our little bark into new and untried waters and sustain the proclamation and usher in a new era? Are we in fact struggling for the Union as it was? Or are we struggling for a more perfect Union? The radical wing in the country says, we've not gone far enough yet. The conservative wing says, unless you renounce the proclamation, or at least give us assurance that it will only be sustained until the end of the war, we cannot support you and you will not be reelected. We can only fight for the Union as it was. The complexities are growing more difficult. The other side has to deal with the same philosophical division. The Democrats have taken a position where the two wings of their party, sundered by the war, just as the Republicans are, have to find either a candidate who will be a war candidate and stand on a peace platform, or be a peace candidate and stand on a war platform, and whatever they do, it'll look ludicrous. The truth of it is, we can succeed in this effort only by concert. It's not a question of cannot we imagine a better plan, but rather, cannot we all do better together? I know very well that not all have agreed with me, and I have not impugned the motives of anyone who has been opposed to me. What we are dealing with is too vast to deal in malice. I have no ill feeling against Southern people. I frankly think that they're just what we would have been had we been born in these circumstances. If slavery had already existed among us, we wouldn't have just instantly gotten rid of it either. And I think if it had not already existed among Southern people, I don't believe they would have introduced it. I've always believed this of people, South as well as North. I think there's probably people on both sides that never would have had a slave under any circumstances, and people on both sides who would gladly see it reintroduced now. The government has a very difficult task to perform, and at best it will do both too little and too much at times, but it cannot properly have any motive of revenge. We must, by all available means, prevent the overthrow of society, but we also should avoid planting thorns in the bosom of society which cannot be later extricated. Important principles, such as Jefferson's, I think must be inflexible. So, I will make it clear. As far as I'm concerned, I have no intention of retracting anything that I have said, regardless of the outcome politically, regarding slavery. I repeat the declaration I made nearly a year ago, that while I remain in my present position, I do not have any intention of retracting or modifying the proclamation of emancipation. And I do not intend to return to slavery any of the persons freed by the terms of that document. If the people of this country next fall shall, by whatever mode or means, determine that it is an executive duty to re-enslave those people, I fear that some other, and not myself, is going to have to become their instrument to perform that. And I do not, in saying all of this, I do not intend any compliment to my own wisdom or sagacity. I frankly do not even claim to have controlled events. I'll confess quite plainly, events have controlled me. Hopefully nearing the end of this struggle now. But this nation's condition is not what either party or any man alone devised or expected. God alone can claim it. I find it so interesting how in every great struggle in history, it seems that each party claims to be acting in accordance with the will of God. Well, both may be, but one must be wrong. I don't think God can be both for and against the same thing at the same time. But as I earlier said, in this struggle, both parties pray to the same God. Now, the prayers of both could not be answered, and that of neither has been answered fully. So we must just continue working in the best light He gives us, trusting that so doing, in fact, conduces to the great ends that He ordains. I believe that He must surely intend for some great good to follow this mighty convulsion, which no mortal could make and no mortal could stay. Well, perhaps some of you have some questions that you would like to tender me regarding the coming election or the activities over the past 3.5 years, or even on a personal basis. I have nothing to hide. And I'd be happy to answer any questions that you might have, if I can. So, and if you're nervous about asking the first question, I'd be happy to take the second question right away. So, shall we begin with this young man right here?
Do you think you will run successfully in the fall?
Do I think I will run successfully in the fall? Well, the proclamation of emancipation is the proverbial fly in the ointment. The numbers, however, cannot be denied. Now, the opposition claims that we could have come to our present position, which is somewhat tenuous. There are nearly 800,000 now just this summer, since last May, have perished. The reports are not good. But the fact remains that within a year after the proclamation was issued, Grant had another 130,000 that were fighting under him. We could not have obtained the present results without them. Now the question is, I had a letter from somebody in Wisconsin who said, he was a Democrat. He said, "You've put me in a very difficult position. We were willing to support the proclamation, believing it to be temporary. And now you've indicated that it will remain in perpetuity insofar as you're concerned. We can no longer sustain you." So it's been presented to me by my own advisors to withdraw my support in order to be reelected. If I do that, I have another very difficult problem, and that is I have destroyed the public faith of this nation forever. So what have I left in my wake? I wish to save the Union, but I wish to save it in such a way so as to leave it worth saving. To tell men who have put their lives on the line and have left their families behind in the South, taking their life in their hand to run to the North and then serve in the military under inferior conditions or unequal pay, to tell them that the promises that were made must now be broken for political reasons, for political expediency, for personal gain. I would not only never be able to sleep again, I would likely be damned in time and eternity for doing that. And so there must be some alternative. I have already decided I will not go back on my word. Whether I am re-elected or not, I must stand on this ground. Now, General Sherman has been fighting in Atlanta for nearly 2 months and has not made much of an advance. If he can somehow win before the election in the fall, then all the Republican claims that the war is being fought is a just war and that it's something that we can actually win will be sustained. But we've not had any victory since Gettysburg and Vicksburg. And the Democrats are continuing to say the war's a failure, it must be stopped, the Republicans are getting rich off of it. And so, I can't answer your question. And see, the Southerners know this. And they proposed a peace conference up at Niagara. And they say, "Oh, we want peace. We want peace. Come to the table." Well, Alexander Stevens and I, he's the vice president down there, you know, we've been friends for a good many years. And I have a good many friends in the South. And I happen to know that Jefferson Davis has made it absolutely clear that they will fight to the last man breathing for independence. And so to come to the table saying, "We want peace," and not mentioning that one condition puts me in a very difficult position. Because if I go to the table and say, "Oh, let's talk about peace with reunion," and they appear to be willing to talk about peace, and then they pull out their high card, it will make me look as though I don't want peace. I don't think there's a man living that wants it more than I. And so the cards are stacked against me right now. And I don't know the answer to your question. But I take great courage from old Andrew Jackson. I never used to like him much, being a Whig and all. And I've grown to appreciate his strength and fortitude and determination. You know, that's what gets General Grant victories. It's just the sheer pertinacity of the man. He fights like a bulldog. He won't let go. Even if he's got hold of the rear end of a bear, he won't let go. And so maybe I can learn. Somebody else? Yes, sir.
Abe, it's my understanding that in the states that remain loyal to the Union and stayed in, slavery is still allowed. What are you going to do about that? How are you going to compensate the people, or what are you going to do to emancipate the whole batch?
You've presented a very there's more than one fly in the ointment. The Proclamation of Emancipation had no legal basis except as an act of war, because slavery is protected by our Constitution. Now, the only means legally, apart from my long expressed views against slavery, the only means legally for me to touch slavery in an executive fashion was as commander-in-chief, as an act of war, when it became of absolute necessity. If I had done it too soon, my opponents would have accused me of doing it from moral principle and not from absolute necessity. But it could only be done as a sort of consequence for taking up arms against your government, for trying to overthrow the Constitution. So I gave the rebels 100 days to lay down their arms, and if they refused to do so within that generous period, the consequence would be their slaves would be declared free. Now, the border states, the ones that you claim are in the Union, technically they are all in the Union, because this whole rebellion is illegal. The so-called president of the Confederate States of America, as they call it, it's mere gossamer. There is no such thing. So, but those that are not in rebellion, it doesn't apply to them. And after all of this is concluded, if we can sustain our efforts through another election without resorting to dictatorship, and I have thought of that sometimes. You know, true dictators don't allow free elections in the middle of a war like this. But if we can sustain ourselves, then my idea is to restore the now rebellious states into their proper relationship with their sister states, with the exception of slavery. Now that will give us 36 states now, only 4 of which are protected by the Constitution, slave-owning states. All we need is a 2/3 majority to pass a constitutional amendment, and those 4 will be taken care of. And Delaware has already emancipated her slaves, so that gives us 3. So, but there's much that has to take place before we get there. Does that make sense? I cannot, as commander-in-chief or as an executive, make laws. I can only, it's my responsibility, according to the Constitution, to ensure that the laws are faithfully executed. And at present, in nearly half of the country, they're not. And that is the basis for the war. So, to change the Constitution is a matter that must be done by amendment to the Constitution. Somebody else?
If you have a question, please raise your hand and wait for a cordless mic so everyone can hear your question. We have one right back here.
Yes, what role did the Lecompton Constitution play in the Lincoln-Douglas debate and in its splitting the National Democratic Party in 1858, which led to your election in 1860, as there were 4 candidates running and you won with just 39% of the vote?
That Constitution was supposed to give the people of Kansas the choice to come in as a free state or a slave state. But in fact, what it did was it said that what slaves were already in Kansas could remain. And there was no means for preventing further slaves from coming in. So they had really no choice. And it was sustained by, some 6,000 votes, with a possibility of some 20,000 people. It was ludicrous. It was just another means of forcing slavery down the throats of the people of Kansas. It played a major role in sustaining the Republican cause before the public. Every time there was more blood shed in Kansas, it hit the Democratic Party square between the eyes and sustained all the things that the Republicans had been saying. So, and that was one of the things I tried to say earlier. Without the sacrifices that were going on here because of that Constitution and all the succeeding troubles after that, I don't think that the Republican cause could have been sustained. I'm convinced that we couldn't have been elected to a national office. So, it was not in vain. Somebody else?
Given the inequalities that the freedmen and slaves have endured, how long do you anticipate it will be before these freedmen will feel as though they are whole citizens? And at what point do you think you may see a black president?
Well, let me answer the first part first and the second part second. For instance, when the people in New York began rioting in New York City over the draft law, it was such a clear example of the terrible level terrifying level of prejudice to go to an orphanage and murder innocent children simply because they were black, to pick people on the street and hang them from lampposts, and the horrors of what happened in New York City and has been continuing for many years in this country are so palpably gross that I fear they may never be overcome. I have for years considered this question: can such momentous ill feeling be overcome? Is there any example in history where an oppressed people have remained within the presence of their one-time oppressors? I cannot find one. And risen to what you propose, the level of equals with great freedom. It's for that reason that I have long believed that the best opportunity for the colored race has been colonization, a voluntary plan for free black citizens to be sustained by the government in colonizing a free black republic in Liberia or Haiti. Well, Haiti didn't. But that has been my thought, that if you put the prospect of the two races with such vitriol and animosity for one another now in the same land, and the other of separating the two, it's the other that looks more hopeful to me. However, the idea which some radicals sustain of forcing this kind of a plan, I don't endorse. before the proclamation was issued, I knew that there would be some who hoped that there would be a forced program following emancipation. I talked with several colored leaders, invited them into the White House, and proposed to them this prospect. And they agreed with me that the level of difficulty between the two races is enormous. But they made it very clear upon returning their answer that they were not interested in going anywhere. I think of Delaney's little expedition to Africa. He endorsed colonization for years. Now, this is a man who was the child of a slave. But when he got to Africa and saw the deplorable conditions under which they live, he returned the report that even under slavery, they live better. And he gave up the ideas of colonization, which I did as well. So that was my hope, because I cannot conceive of how these two races can come into a proper relationship with this history. How long that may take, I think it depends entirely on how we conduct ourselves in the present. We have the very difficult job, after all of this is over, is making friends out of former enemies. Whether in politics or in warfare, that's one of the hardest things. Your own Senator Pomeroy has been one that has refused to mend fences with me. And try as I might, sometimes you cannot do that. And so I want to restore the Union so as to make it a union of hearts and hands as well as of states. I think if we can accomplish that, then there's a brighter prospect. But if the radicals take over and they use acrimony and vengeance as their main tool, what happened in New York City, taking it out on the poor black man, will happen throughout the South. And I couldn't make any predictions. This is politics. And things change from moment to moment, it seems. But that is my intention if I live through this. And now, the second part of your question, a black president. First, we have to get them some legal standing as persons, and then some voting rights, and then maybe we can talk about making one of them president. But apart from that prospect, I'd like to know what his politics are before I vote for him. Somebody else. There's a roving, what did they call that, a microphone?
Yes.
Somewhere, but I don't know. Oh, I hear it,
I'm
but I don't
wondering.
see it.
I'm wondering how Mary feels about you running again and continuing life in Washington.
Mrs. Lincoln has had a very difficult road to hoe. She has always been a very capable person in a political sense, but somehow Washington has thrown all of her compasses askew. And the Southerners, the old dowagers in Washington, believe that she's a traitor to their cause. And the Republicans, who are in control at the moment, view her as a possible secessionist, with so much of her family sustaining the Southern cause at the moment. She's a Western woman, You go out there and they think you got a hayseed in your clothes if you live west of the Alleghenies. So there's almost nothing that she can do that is sustained by the public. When Mrs. Wells goes to the hospital with baskets of fruit, it's in all the newspapers. When Mrs. Lincoln goes to the hospital with baskets of fruits, it's in none of the newspapers. That's the reality of the situation. And yet, with all of that opposition, Mrs. Lincoln is almost anxious for me to be reelected, and I know not why. I believe she understands that if I am not, then the war will be brought to a swift end. The Southerners will have won. And if they win, it essentially ruins all future hope of liberty. If any discontented minority who cannot obtain the results of an election legally can resort to violence and win, the whole basis of free government is destroyed. And I think Mrs. Lincoln understands that as well as the next person. So it's been very hard. A year ago she had an accident and has had frightful headaches, physical difficulties resulting from striking her head on a rock, the loss of our children, the fear of Robert joining the military. Every mother can understand these things. So, and yet, underneath all of it, she's a plucky woman. That's one of the reasons why I married her. And I don't think she's going to flag or fail in the cause.
Do we have one last question? Chelsea, you have one?
Sir, in your thinking about signing the Emancipation Proclamations, what were some of your reasons? How much did saving the Union weigh as opposed to maybe a war strategy that you would be depriving the South of labor? What were some of the considerations that led you to signing the Proclamation of Emancipation?
Well, all through '62, on 3 separate occasions, I presented to border state governors the possibility of a gradual compensated emancipation. We simply were not winning. If they had accepted that would have turned the tide. But after the final refusal, and I understand why, I realized that we would have to resort to something revolutionary. I never wanted this to devolve into a mere revolutionary struggle. I don't think it is only that. But we have had to use, our case is new. We've had to think anew and act anew in order to save this country. And so a general emancipation, a sudden emancipation, for all of its faults, became the only alternative. On a military basis, as I alluded to earlier, the sheer numbers of it was the foundation. But there were some other considerations. There was talk that in Europe there would be a recognition in England, possibly France, of the Southerners as a national entity, which would have changed the configuration on an international scale. It's what Southerners desperately wanted. There was a hope that for every added benefit that we had received from freed people coming over to our side, that much less labor would be accomplished on the southern side. And they were devising a multitude of new means to employ slave labor in the war effort. And so those were the primary considerations. But I must say that it is not a question of politics or personal feeling. I was elected to do a fairly simple task as the executive to ensure that the laws are faithfully executed. There are a few other duties that fall upon the president, but that has grown into a monumental task and has involved war. If I can accomplish my task without war, then that had to be my duty. If we could have done that without a war. And once the war commenced, if I could have brought the war to an end without touching slavery, that had to be my duty. Or if the only way to bring the war to an end and sustain the Union was to free all the slaves, then that had to be my duty. Or perhaps to free some of them and leave others alone. But my duty was always clear, and continues to be, to ensure that the laws are faithfully executed in the land. So there are those who say that I've turned from my duty and am now prosecuting an abolitionist war. That's not true. Well, you have been most kind, and I am happy to chat with. Are there more questions? I think that you did. Wasn't it mentioned that this was the last?
That is the final question, Mr. President.
Well,
Everybody thank Fritz Klein for an extraordinary performance.